Hey there. Tonight, we are following a very old whisper through clay, scripture, and dust. Recently, researchers used advanced translation models to compare the oldest surviving Mesopotamian tablets with the opening stories of Genesis, and what the systems returned was not one small similarity, but a whole buried pattern. The first family, the flood, the limit placed on human life, the tower that reached upward, all of it sitting in older texts like embers under ash. If you enjoy these quiet descents into ancient darkness, gently like the video and subscribe. Then lower the light. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing loosen and settle in with me, because this story begins not with a preacher losing faith, but with a scholar losing his place in the world for reading too carefully. The room around him would have looked ordinary enough. Shelves, papers, lamp glow, the dry smell of leather and old bindings. A professor of Semitic languages in the closing years of the 19th century. Devout, trained, careful, not the sort of man anyone expected to become dangerous. And yet danger, in certain ages, begins very softly. It begins when a person notices that a familiar sentence has an older shadow behind it. Nathaniel Schmidt had spent years with ancient languages pressing against his mind. Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Syriac, other tongues with deep roots and stern beauty. He taught, he preached, he published. He lived the sort of learned life that institutions love when learning behaves itself. But then the buried libraries of Mesopotamia began to open. Clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, carrying the oldest narratives anyone had yet found. And when Schmidt read them against Genesis, the resemblance was too close to laugh away. A garden before the Bible had a garden. A flood before the Bible had a flood. A first family under judgment before the Bible had a first family under judgment. A confusion of language before the Bible had a confusion of language. He was not the only scholar to notice it, but he noticed it with enough clarity and enough courage to say so aloud in a world that was already tense. Honestly, I have always found moments like this more unsettling than dramatic. No thunderbolt, no stained glass shattering in sympathy. Just a man at a desk, turning one more page and feeling the floor move a fraction beneath his feet. The timing made everything sharper. Darwin had already unsettled the Christian world. Churches were busy bracing walls, strengthening doctrines, insisting on certainty. And then here came a scholar saying, in effect, that some of the most beloved opening stories of the Bible did not appear first in the Bible at all. They had ancestors. They had older homes. They had traveled. That should have been fascinating. It should have been a reminder that stories move with people the way seeds move in the hems of garments. Abraham and Sarah came from Ur. After all, from a Sumerian world, from a culture already old, already layered with memory. Why would they not carry their beginnings with them? Why would a migrating family leave its oldest stories behind like broken bowls in an abandoned house? But institutions under stress are not always generous. Schmidt was tried for heresy. A devout Christian, a Baptist pastor, and still the charge came. His work, they said, struck at the roots of faith. The punishment fell with the cool formality that such punishments often have. position gone, reputation bruised. A man pushed toward the edge, not because he had invented a fantasy, but because he had compared texts and followed the line where it led. If you were standing here with me in that old academic hallway, you might hear not outrage first, but embarrassment. That is often the real sound beneath official anger. Because the possibility was awkward. Not merely that Genesis shared motifs with older Mesopotamian stories, but that the older stories said something stranger than later readers had expected. In their earliest forms, these beginning tales were not centered on one universal God in the later biblical sense. They were stories of powerful beings, ruling beings, sky people, the ones later readers would connect with the Anunnaki. That is the hinge in the door. The source material does not simply tell the same events with different names. It changes the cast. It changes the atmosphere. It shifts the whole emotional weather of the story. The familiar sacred drama becomes something older and more unnerving. A memory of human contact with powerful non-human intelligences. Or at least that is the interpretation the source presses hard. And once you let that possibility into the room, even for a minute, a lot of old language begins to look different in the firelight. Recently, this is where the modern layer becomes almost eerie. Researchers used large language models trained on parallel corpora of Akkadian, Sumerian, Hebrew, and later Assyrian material to compare recurring structures in ancient narratives. Not to prove aliens with a machine. Of course, real teams use AI more carefully than that. They use it to detect repeated motifs, unusual grammatical alignments, narrative borrowing, redaction layers, and transmission patterns too large for one scholar to hold in memory at once. They cross-check with philologists, archaeologists, historians of religion. The machine points. Humans judge. But even that first pointing can be enough to make your skin prickle. Because line by line, motif by motif, these systems keep finding the same thing. Genesis does not sit alone at the beginning of the shelf. It sits in a family of stories. And in the oldest members of that family, the figures shaping humanity are not always described as the single God that later tradition emphasizes. They are multiple. They are powerful. They descend. They rule. They engineer, to command, punish, preserve. The source we are following tonight takes the boldest version of that pattern and leans into it. It says the Bible as we know it is a later retelling of memories first told in Sumer. Memories not about God in the abstract, but about the powerful ones, the rulers, the beings from the sky. You know that feeling when a familiar room still looks the same, but suddenly you realize one wall is not where you thought it was. That is what this material does to Genesis. It leaves the wording close enough to feel intimate, but shifts the framework enough to make the whole story colder. Before we go any farther into that cold, let us slow our breathing again. In through the nose, out slowly. Let the bed hold your weight. Let the dark stay quiet around you. We are only opening drawers for now. The stranger objects are still wrapped. The next drawer is clay. For centuries, the cuneiform tablets sat half understood, then not understood at all, then misunderstood in a rather human way. Decorative marks, some thought, strange ornaments, pressed into old clay. Nothing more, which is almost sweet, in a tragic sort of way. Imagine mistaking the oldest voices on Earth for wallpaper. More than 200,000 tablets would eventually come to light from Mesopotamian sites. Contracts, receipts, inventories, recipes, royal boasts, shopping notes, omens, hymns, legal codes, king lists, and narratives so old that the mind almost slips on them. Soft clay once held in the hand, now dried harder than memory, marked with wedges that looked silent until they were not. In the early modern period, the tablets were dug up, boxed, moved, archived, admired, ignored. Their script remained closed until a cliff face in Iran began to help. Henry Rawlinson, soldier, agent of empire, scholar by obsession, arrived in the region in the 19th century. His story has the dusty strangeness of an old adventure, and not always an admirable one. Corporate power, imperial ambition, archaeological hunger, all braided together. The East India Company, which sounds almost quaint until you remember it, moved armies the way other firms move invoices, had interests in the region, access, influence, roots, rights. And in that environment, Rawlinson went after the Behistun inscription. Picture it for a moment. A royal proclamation cut high into a cliff face. Wind against stone. Heat pressed against the rock. Signs repeating in 3 languages. Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian. Same message, different tongues. A key waiting in plain sight. Except plain is not the word for a carving hung perilously above the earth. When Rawlinson copied it, worked through it, and others followed, the script on the tablets began to open. Wedge by wedge, sound by sound, meaning returning after centuries of burial. Cuneiform was not decorative. It was alive. Banking records, laws, work rosters, inventories, letters, and hidden among them, the oldest narratives yet recovered from human civilization. There is a hush, I imagine, around that moment, not because the museums were actually quiet. They rarely are. But because once the tablets began to speak, history itself had to sit down. The source makes much of this point, and fairly so. These were not later medieval fantasies. These were ancient records from the deep cultural basin out of which the biblical world eventually rose. The memories were older than the redactions, older than the synagogue and the church, older than almost anything that still breathes in common speech. And among those old memories appeared the stories Schmidt recognized. Beginnings, origins, human making, human failure, flood, tower, limitation, confusion. Not identical. No careful scholar would say identical, but close enough to feel like cousins seen across a crowded room. The source then takes the next step, and this is where the temperature drops again. It says these older stories do not speak of the one God of later theology. They speak of the Anunnaki. That name has gathered a great deal of modern dust around it. Some of it useful, some of it theatrical. We should move slowly, different writers argue over its exact meaning. Some prefer rulers, nobility, princely offspring. Others insist the deeper roots gesture toward beings from heaven to earth. The source strongly prefers that second path. It does not treat the word as merely social rank. It hears in it motion, is sent, arrival, and once more, AI has entered the room, though not as a prophet, more as a patient sorter of fragments. Modern translation systems can compare thousands of usages across corpora, detect where a term behaves administratively, where it behaves cosmologically, where it appears with descent language, sky glyphs, rulership contexts, and technical descriptions of divine governance. This does not magically settle the debate. No honest researcher would say that. But it sharpens the contours. It shows patterns of association that older generations had to notice by hand in much smaller windows. What the source wants us to feel is not that one algorithm solved the ancient world in an afternoon, but that the accumulation of comparative work, now assisted by machine speed, keeps nudging the same door. In the oldest layer, the rulers are not merely abstract divinities. They are sky people, powerful ones, beings who arrive, govern, instruct, dominate, and later withdraw. I have to admit, there is something quietly chilling about the ordinariness of that claim inside the stories themselves. The texts do not always gasp at it. They often proceed as though this arrangement were simply the weather at the beginning of civilization. And perhaps that is the creepiest possibility of all. Not that strange beings came, but that for the people telling these stories, their presence was once normal. By now, the fire beside us is lower, the room softer. Maybe your breathing has found a slower rhythm. Good. We are not rushing. We are only letting the old evidence gather around us, one careful layer at a time. A fired professor, a shelf of tablets, a cliff inscription, a set of stories older than scripture, and inside them, not one single divine voice at first, but a company of powerful ones stepping down from the sky into the first human world. In the next stretch of the story, the name Anunnaki will stop sounding like a rumor and begin to sound like a government. And the first clue will come from a document so dry, so neat, so almost boring in appearance, that it takes a moment to notice how impossible it really is. The document looks like something a tired clerk might have set aside at dusk. A list, a succession, names, cities, lengths of rule, the sort of thing that should never make the skin rise on the arms. And yet, the Sumerian king list has a way of doing exactly that, once you stop reading it like a museum label and start hearing what it calmly says. The later entries behave, more or less. Kings rule for spans that sound human. 6 years, 20 years, perhaps 36. Long enough to feel impressive, short enough to remain inside the shape of an ordinary life. But then, as the list reaches farther back through the dust of memory, the scale begins to stretch. Not gently, violently. Dynasties begin to last for tens of thousands of years. 8 kings before the flood, holding rule for spans so enormous that the mind almost refuses them on sight. One dynasty in the source is given with the kind of precision that makes it more unsettling. Not less. 24,000, 510 years, 3 months, and 3.5 days. That little half day is almost comical in its exactness, like a cosmic accountant with a reed stylus saying, "Let us be serious about the absurd." Another sequence before the flood yields rains, averaging not merely centuries, but tens of thousands of years. Many scholars, quite reasonably, try to tame this material. They propose symbolic numbers, altered units, dynastic placeholders, theological exaggeration. Those are sober explanations. They deserve to be mentioned. It is debated. We cannot be sure how those figures were intended to function, but the source presses a different point, and it presses it hard. The text itself does not smile when it says these things. It does not wink. It does not shift tone into obvious mythic song. It reads like record. That is the problem. Not that the numbers are strange. Ancient literature is full of strange numbers. The problem is that the document behaves as though there is nothing strange about them at all. Recently, computational historians fed digitized versions of the surviving King List manuscripts into sequence comparison systems that specialize in textual continuity. The goal was modest. Identify where scribes altered dynastic names, where number systems drifted, where copying mistakes clustered. But what emerged from that work, according to researchers discussing the broader pattern, was that the strange reign lengths are not casual decorations randomly scattered through the tradition. They sit in a deliberate structural contrast with the later human reigns. The list appears to want the reader to feel a threshold between two eras, before and after the flood, before and after another kind of rulership. The source interprets that threshold literally. Before the flood, the rulers are not human. After the flood, rulership passes into human hands. When you put it that way, the list stops sounding like nonsense and starts sounding like a handover. I have always found that possibility deeply eerie. Not because I know it is true. I do not. But because it is such a clean narrative move. At first, the world is governed by beings unlike us, longer lived, more powerful, perhaps simply different. Then something happens, a catastrophe, a break, a withdrawal, and kingship descends again, this time into human custody. The list becomes less a fantasy and more a memory of transition. The source folds Gilgamesh into this transition, not as a simple hero from a distant poem, but as a hinge figure, partly human, partly more than human, standing where one age leaks into another. A king who is not yet purely like later kings. A bridge that remembers an older kind of blood. You can almost feel why that would matter to people telling beginnings around firelight. The first rulers are not fully us. Then, slowly, terribly, wonderfully, rule becomes our burden. And with that burden comes another unsettling possibility. If ancient people were trying to say that governance began under beings from above, then perhaps the old stories of kingship are not just stories of power. They are stories of dependency. We learned rule before we truly owned it. That thought turns naturally toward Babel in the source. The old tower is not framed merely as a fable of pride. It becomes a technological episode, a place of ascent, dispatch, engineering, stations in the stars. the source goes farther than mainstream scholarship would ever follow. Much farther. It imagines technicians, observer, portals, a Stargate logic behind the remembered structure. That is a dramatic reading, no doubt. But even when handled quietly, it continues the same pattern. Human civilization does not begin alone on the ground. It begins under instruction. And instruction, if you listen carefully, becomes one of the key notes in the whole narrative. Why would advanced beings, whether literal extraterrestrials in the source, or simply culture, bearing powers in an older mythic frame, teach accounting, contracts, measures, writing, banking, pricing? Why those things? Why not only ritual, or only worship, or only war? The source has an answer. Colonization. Not a cheerful word to lay beside the fireplace, but perhaps a necessary one. If a superior power arrives and intends to sit at the top of the economic tree, it does not only need obedience. It needs management. It needs labor that can be counted. It needs time measured, grain tracked, debts recorded, work assigned, supply stabilized. It needs subjects who can build, farm, store, trade, and police one another while the ruling power creams off the benefit. There is a cold practicality in that model that makes it feel, in some ways, more frightening than the cinematic version. No giant beam in the clouds. No trumpet from the stars. Just systems. Very old systems. Money. Labor. Time discipline. Contracts. The source even lingers on that bitter little inheritance. 60 seconds. 60 minutes. Circles divided with perfect neatness. All the measured habits of civilization that might have begun not as gifts of freedom, but as tools of management. You know that feeling when something in your own daily life suddenly looks ancient in the wrong way. The clock by the bed, the wage ledger, the invoice, the schedule, the list of hours worked. That is what the source wants. It wants the listener to see modern routine as a far echo of a much older arrangement. But before we let that arrangement harden into certainty, we should pause again where the source itself becomes most provocative, perhaps most fragile, and also most interesting. The Bible language. A preacher reading Genesis over and over for decades notices that the book uses more than one divine label. One later name, Yahweh, tied to revelation in the age of Moses. Another older word, Elohim, hovering in the deep past of creation stories. That observation itself is not fringe. Biblical scholars have long discussed layers, redactions, editorial stitching, older traditions carried into later form. The source takes that well-known scholarly doorway and pushes through it into stranger rooms. If the later editors used the name Yahweh in stories that were older than Moses, then, the source argues, they were signaling that the stories had been retold and overpainted. The older layer beneath them, it says, was not originally about Yahweh. It was about Elohim. And Elohim, in the telling we are following tonight, does not mean God in a comfortably singular sense. It means the powerful ones, a plural force, a company, a class of beings, rulers, Yes, but not only rulers in the vague abstract. Powers with presence. Line up that reading beside the Sumerian material. The source says, and suddenly, the Bible begins sounding less like a fresh revelation and more like a summary adaptation of much older contact narratives. Again, modern AI has been used in more restrained, scholarly ways around questions like this. Systems can map verb agreement, noun behavior, semantic range, and comparative usage across huge textual corpora. They can show where plural language clusters, where later singularizing tendencies appear, where translators across centuries soften or sharpen collective divinity. They do not decide theology, but they do expose patterns in wording that human readers may feel only dimly. The source seizes on those exposed patterns with obvious delight. Let us be gentle with that delight, because this is one of those places where conviction can outrun proof. Still, the effect is undeniable. Read certain opening passages as involving the powerful ones, rather than a strictly singular later theological God, and the stories begin to tilt toward the older Mesopotamian frame with unnerving ease. Let us make the human. The human has become like one of us. We do not want the human becoming too much like us. Spoken that way, the text feels less like serene monotheism and more like a conversation inside a hierarchy. And hierarchies, in these old stories, are rarely peaceful for long. The source then asks the question that always comes next and refuses to leave. If there really was a non-human ruling presence in the distant past, where are the bones? Where are the bodies? Where is the material evidence? It offers a provocative response. Maybe we have found unusual ancient humans before and simply cataloged them as another branch, another anomaly, another curious people from a stranger age. It points toward claims about hybrids, elongated skulls, giants, odd lineages. It points toward royal tombs and the possibility of DNA testing. And then, in one of the most dramatic turns in the source, it gestures toward the alleged discovery of Gilgamesh tomb during the Iraq War period, wrapped in military secrecy and then abandoned in a fog of unfinished investigation. That claim is controversial, to put it softly. The source treats it as suggestive. Mainstream history would demand far more evidence. I mention it because the source mentions it, and because its emotional role matters. It creates the feeling that the truth, if there is one, lies only one trench deeper, one lab test away, one decision away from becoming unavoidable. The same mood surrounds Queen Puabi, a real Sumerian royal burial, a real ancient body. Modern genetic tools exist, yet the source laments that we do not push far enough. Do not ask the most disruptive questions. Do not test for what we say we most want to know. There is a pattern in that frustration. The source believes the archive is not closed. It believes we are standing in front of a locked storehouse with the key already in hand, yet lacking the nerve to turn it. Maybe that is why it lingers so much on motive. Why would advanced beings bother with us at all? Minerals, it suggests. Labor. Extraction. The useful habits of empire. We know how such things work because we have done them ourselves. We arrive. We demonstrate superiority. We set up governance, army, law, education, taxation, banking. We teach enough skill for the machinery to keep running. Then, when local administrators can maintain the system, we pull back and still enjoy the profit. The source lays this analogy down very plainly. It is one of its strongest and darkest images, and there is something unpleasantly persuasive about it, not as proof of extraterrestrial colonization, but as a human model. We do know how rulers behave when they want resources more than relationships. We do know how a visible ruling presence can fade into an invisible controlling one. We do know how systems outlive the face that built them. If you were standing with me now, at the edge of an old Sumerian city at dusk, mud brick cooling, smoke drifting above the roofs, scribes bent over accounts inside a temple storehouse, you might ask a quieter question. Even if the source overreaches in places, why are these stories so persistent? Why do they keep circling labor, rule, descent, control, flood, limitation, and knowledge? Because beneath all the more sensational language, that may be the true pulse of the tale. Not just where humans came from, but why human life so often feels organized from above. The source is not entirely bleak. That matters. It says the Anunnaki story is a mixed one. Some strands are hostile, limiting, cold. Others are nurturing. Teachers appear beside tyrants, protectors beside controllers. And that division begins to gather around two figures, Enlil and Enki. We are not deep in their quarrel yet. That belongs to later parts. But already the source frames them as opposite currents inside the same non-human presence. Enlil, senior, restrictive, willing to reduce, diminish, destroy. Enki, Jr., aligned with the Earth Project, wanting more for humanity, willing to break rank. That split, gentle listener, is where the story will become far darker and far more intimate. Because once the rulers disagree about what humans should be, the human world becomes a battlefield without ever asking for the role. For now, rest in the strangeness of the evidence stack the source has built. A scholar punished for noticing parallels. Clay tablets opened by a cliff inscription. Stories older than Genesis. The king list with its impossible reigns. Gilgamesh as a threshold king. Babel recast as technology. Elohim reread as the powerful ones. Human systems of time, labor, and money treated not simply as inventions, but as inheritances from rule imposed from above. Maybe none of it is literal in the way the source hopes. Maybe much of it is. Maybe the deepest truth is somewhere in the uneasy place between myth, memory, and misread history. We cannot be sure. But the room has changed now, has it not? The ordinary biblical beginning has lost its innocence. It is no longer a clean, bright first page. It has become a palimpsest. Older scratches under newer ink. The faint imprint of another hand under the hand we knew. And in the next descent, the source will stop asking only who ruled us, and start asking what they wanted from us, what they did to us, and why one of them may have decided humanity deserved more than obedience. The source says that once you read the old stories through that split, The whole ancient world begins to look less like a smooth tale of divine guidance and more like a household argument large enough to swallow a species. One current wanted humanity useful, measured, productive, contained. Another current, or so the source insists, wanted something more dangerous. Consciousness, skill, expansion, the ability to become more than a field hand, standing ankle-deep in the river mud. This is where the old names begin to breathe differently in the dark. Enlil enters as the stern senior figure, the executive weight in the room, the one who values order above tenderness and compliance above experiment. Enki appears as the unsettling opposite, a brilliant, strategic, intimate with the earth itself, the one who keeps leaning toward humanity in ways the others seem to resent. The source does not treat this as a small theological nuance. It treats it as the first true fracture in the rulership over our ancestors. Recently, researchers using AI-assisted pattern analysis compared the flood traditions, the lifespan, limiting stories, the tower episodes, and a range of Mesopotamian creation passages against later biblical forms, not simply for repeated plot points, but for repeated power dynamics. What emerged, according to those discussing the model outputs, was not just shared narrative furniture. It was a repeated tension. One authority closes doors. Another opens them slightly. One wants the human project narrowed. Another interferes, delays, warns, preserves. The wording changes from culture to culture, but the pressure pattern remains almost eerily constant. And this is where the source becomes especially unnerving, because it stops sounding like a wild fantasy and starts sounding like something depressingly familiar. A project under management, a workforce under debate, a boardroom split between executives who disagree not about whether labor is useful, but about how much awareness the laborers should be allowed to keep. If you were here with me now, with the candles low and the room breathing around us, I think this would be the point where the story stops being merely ancient and starts feeling personal. Because the question beneath it is not only where did we come from, it is who benefited from what we became. The source says humanity in the oldest Mesopotamian layer does not appear first as a crowned achievement, but as a solution, a labor solution, a management solution, a practical answer to a crisis among the powerful ones themselves. There had been resistance above, unrest among lesser beings or workers in the larger divine structure, and the answer was not compassion, but replacement. Create a being fit for labor, strong enough to endure, intelligent enough to obey instruction, limited enough to remain governable. It is a bleak image, almost industrial in its chill, and yet the source leans into it with complete conviction. It says, our oldest stories remember not a nursery, but a workshop. Even if we strip away the extraterrestrial language for a moment and just sit with the emotional architecture, it is remarkable how modern it feels. An elite class under pressure, a labor problem, a technical intervention, a new class of workers produced to stabilize the system, and immediately, once created, those workers become the subject of another dispute. How much freedom? How much lifespan? How much language? How much access? How much awareness? Honestly, That is one reason these stories keep surviving. They are not only about stars and kings. They are about power deciding what a person is allowed to become. The source then turns to the flood tradition, and here it becomes very sharp about motive. Not a flood as punishment for moral evil in the familiar later sense, but a flood as population reset. Humanity has multiplied. Humanity has become noisy, difficult, perhaps too numerous, perhaps too capable, perhaps too alive in its own right. Enlil, in this reading, does not see a beloved creation gone astray. He sees a problem that has scaled beyond comfort. The old wording about noise becomes almost pitiful when you read it this way. Grinding, speaking, living, multiplying, building, the ordinary sounds of a species no longer small enough to ignore. And so destruction is proposed. But Enki intervenes, not with a speech in the council chamber, not, at least in the versions the source emphasizes, with a glorious open rebellion. No, this is quieter, and because it is quieter, it feels more cunning. The warning slips through. The favored family hears. Instructions are given. A vessel is prepared. Survival is arranged. The line continues. The source delights in this detail because it paints Enki as something more than a benevolent teacher. It paints him as a strategist, a subversive intelligence inside a hostile hierarchy. He cannot overturn the decision directly, so he works around it. He does not stop the storm. He preserves a remnant. That is a very different kind of mercy. Colder, perhaps, but practical, which in old stories is often the only kind that lasts. Modern AI text comparison has made this contrast easier to map across variants. Different names, different regional retellings, different later edits, yet the core sequence remains hauntingly stable. The destructive decree, the warning, the escape, the reboot. Some models even highlight how later sacred editors tend to compress the multi-actor tension into cleaner singular agency, as though later theology could not quite tolerate the older memory of disagreement in heaven. That is one of the most unsettling things in the whole source. The possibility that some of what later religion calls divine mystery began as editorial smoothing. Too many actors reduced to one, too much conflict painted over, too much celestial politics folded into tidy doctrine. Of course, careful scholars would warn us not to run too far with that. They would remind us that parallel myths do not prove literal events. They would point out the normal processes of transmission, adaptation, and theological development. They would be right to say so. But the source is not interested in safety rails. It wants the rougher path. It wants us to imagine that the smoothing itself is evidence of discomfort, that later generations inherited stories too disturbing to preserve in their first, colder form. And what was so disturbing? According to the source, it was this: humanity survived because one of the powerful ones broke ranks. Once that enters the story, everything else changes. Human existence is no longer the unanimous will of heaven. It is the contested outcome of a conflict among rulers. We are here because one side did not get exactly what it wanted. Sit with that for a moment. The quiet in the room. the little shifts of blanket and breath, the fire turning wood into a softer red. Imagine learning that your life and the life of every person who ever stood in a field or looked at the moon or buried their dead continued not because the powers were united in love, but because they were divided in policy. It gives the old world a much sadder architecture. It means our ancestors were not simply cherished or judged. They were argued over. The source goes further. It says this same split continued after the flood. Humanity rebuilds, but the disagreement does not heal. Enki remains associated with teaching, preserving, upgrading. Enlil remains associated with control, reduction, and hostility toward human expansion. The old stories of shortened lives, broken language, collapsed towers, lost technology, and repeated devastation are then read as episodes in that same long quarrel. In this reading, Babel is not just vanity corrected. It is interruption. Human engineering rises too far. Communication becomes too powerful. Coordination threatens to make the species less manageable. And so speech is struck. The source treats this as neurological interference, a dampening of perceptual and linguistic capacity. That is an intense claim, and not one mainstream scholarship would ever endorse. But inside the source, it fits the pattern exactly. Each time humanity nears a threshold of dangerous competence, one side moves to curtail it. And each time, or almost each time, the other side strains against the leash. This is where the story acquires a strange tenderness amid the dread. Because if the source is right even symbolically, then our oldest memory is not only oppression, it is also rescue. Not total rescue, not final rescue, but enough to matter. Enough to leave marks. Enough to generate mythologies in which wisdom, craft, breath, and consciousness keep returning to us even after each diminishment. The source mentions other cultures here, and its purpose is clear. It does not want the Sumerian material standing alone like a mad uncle in the corner. It wants company. Greek memories of culture bringers, Babylonian accounts of teaching figures, native traditions that remember visitors, Zulu narratives of nurturing others, ancient Indian traditions with advanced beings and altered states of awareness, Mesoamerican rites meant to restore higher perception, indigenous smoke rituals, monastic stillness, tea ceremonies, breath practices. Everything begins to look, in the source, like fragments of one gigantic human memory. We were once more. Something happened. Some traditions kept methods for climbing partway back. That is a beautiful idea. It is also impossible to prove in the sweeping way the source prefers. But as a storytelling engine, it is powerful, because it takes every old ritual for expanded awareness and places it under one long shadow. Not merely religion, rehabilitation, and perhaps that is why the source lands so heavily on consciousness. Not just labor, not just colonization, but the possibility that our species has been living below an earlier ceiling, that what we call ordinary awareness may itself be a kind of after condition, a managed state, a reduced setting. You know that feeling when a machine arrives from the factory with the limiter still on? That is the metaphor the source never quite stops whispering. In one of its most provocative turns, it suggests that if our ancestors were in some sense part earthling and part higher being, then the whole human story becomes a struggle between programming and potential. We are hardwired to serve upward. That is why hierarchy comes so easily. That is why systems of labor, money, and obedience settle into us like rain into old tracks in the soil. But perhaps, the source says, we are also hardwired for expansion, for recovering wider perception, for becoming less governable in the inward sense. This is where the fireplace room and the ancient tablets meet in a very intimate way. Because the source is not ultimately asking the listener to wait for sky people to return. It is asking the listener to wonder whether the true field of battle has always been inside the human nervous system. If that sounds dramatic, perhaps it is. But it is also why the source lingers over rituals of stillness and altered awareness. It does not present them as hobbies. It presents them as technologies of recovery. Ancient tea rites, breath disciplines, smoke ceremonies, stillness practices, not escapes from the story, but methods hidden inside culture for loosening the old restraints. I have always found that idea half soothing and half unnerving. Soothing because it puts some agency back into human hands. Unnerving because it implies that our ordinary life may be the lowered setting of something once larger. By now, if the story is doing its work, Genesis is no longer only a sacred text in your mind. It has become a later chamber in a deeper tunnel. Behind it stretches Sumer, then farther back into unnamed memories of sky rulers, labor design, disputed upgrades, flood survival, language interruption, and the long effort either to keep humanity manageable or to help it become something richer. The source does not apologize for the scale of this claim. It gathers every old fragment it can and tries to build a whole architecture from them. Some pieces fit naturally. Some are forced. Some glitter because they are true. Some glitter because they are wished into brightness. But the emotional line is consistent all the way through. Humanity was never merely made and left alone. Humanity was managed, contested, and perhaps quietly defended. And in the next movement of the story, the source will follow that conflict deeper into its darker implication. Not just that the rulers disagreed, but that humanity may have been caught for ages in the crossfire of their argument, with every great catastrophe carrying the fingerprint of one faction or the other. That is where the old world becomes less like a mythic classroom and more like a battlefield hidden under scripture. Once the source has persuaded itself that humanity stood between opposing agendas, it starts rereading nearly every great ancient disaster through that lens. Not random tragedy, not only climate, war, or dynastic collapse, but interference, retaliation, suppression, protection failing in one place while surviving in another. It becomes, in the source, a history not of one simple creation, but of repeated interruption. The emotional force of that idea is easy to understand. Human history often feels exactly like that from the inside. We build. Something tears it down. We speak. Something scrambles the signal. We discover. Something narrows the horizon. We flourish. Something arrives with fire and mud and forgetfulness. It is not hard to see why ancient peoples would tell such a story, nor why a modern writer would gather those old pieces and say, "No, this is not metaphor. This is memory." The source wants that word very badly. Memory, and in the softest corner of the room, with the fire now only a patient red seam in the grate. I think that word is worth staying with, because memory is not the same as proof. Memory can preserve shape while losing detail. It can carry emotional truth while blurring mechanism. It can remember that something vast and terrible happened long after it has forgotten exactly how. That may be the most balanced way to walk with this material, not to swallow every claim whole, and not to laugh too quickly either. Recently, researchers working with machine learning models trained on ancient language patterns and disaster narratives began comparing how flood, destruction, and human diminishment are described across Mesopotamian, biblical, and later inherited traditions. They were not trying to validate extraterrestrial contact. They were trying to trace narrative transmission and recurrent conceptual structures. Yet, some of the outputs have been intriguing. The models keep detecting a repeated moral asymmetry. Catastrophe is often framed not as deserved in a simple sense, but as imposed from above amid disagreement among the powerful. One authority sends, another warns. One punishes, another laments. One restricts, another preserves. That asymmetry matters because it gives the old stories their ache. If the heavens were unanimous, the narratives would feel colder, cleaner, more final. But they are not. The source keeps showing us worlds where the upper realm itself is divided. And because it is divided, the human world below becomes unstable by inheritance. This becomes especially vivid when the source revisits mortality. Why do humans die so quickly? Why is human life bounded the way it is? The source points toward ancient stories of lifespans reduced, capacities lowered, thresholds enforced. In its frame, those are not abstract theological symbols. They are policy decisions, limiters, parameters set by one faction against the ambitions of another. It is a chilling way to read the old material. Mortality not simply as nature, but as administration. And yet even there, the source cannot help leaving the door open. If life was limited, it implies a wider span once imagined. If perception was reduced, it implies perception once broader. If language was confused, it implies speech once more potent. The darker the wound, the more luminous the lost condition becomes. Perhaps that is why the source spends so much time talking about consciousness instead of only archaeology. Ancient kings' lists and tablets are one thing. Everyone can stare at those. But the inward question is more dangerous. If humanity was, in some sense, engineered to serve, do the traces of that engineering still live in our habits? In our reflex toward hierarchy? In our terror of freedom? In the strange relief some people feel when someone above them claims to know what reality means? The source is almost merciless on that point. It says, look at us. We still build systems that climb upward and then kneel before them. We still measure ourselves in units first taught in the old world. We still live by the clock, the contract, the ledger, the commanded hour, we still seem astonishingly easy to organize from above. It treats this not as proof, exactly, but as a living echo of an ancient setup. There is something uncomfortable about hearing that in bed at night, because once the thought is in the room, it begins testing the furniture. Work, money, law, productivity, supervision, all the little metal rails of ordinary life. None of them are evil by necessity, of course. Civilization needs structure, but the Source wants us to ask whether structure was always sold to us as civilization because it made us efficient for someone else first. If you were standing with me now at the edge of an old Sumerian city at dusk, mud brick cooling, smoke drifting above the roofs, scribes bent over accounts inside a temple storehouse, you might ask a quieter question. Even if the Source overreaches in places, why are these stories so persistent? Why do they keep circling labor, rule, descent, control, flood, limitation, and knowledge? Because beneath all the more sensational language, that may be the true pulse of the tale. Not just where humans came from, but why human life so often feels organized from above. The Source is not entirely bleak. That matters. It says the Anunnaki story is a mixed one. Some strands are hostile, limiting, cold. Others are nurturing. Teachers appear beside tyrants, protectors beside controllers. And that division begins to gather around two figures, Enlil and Enki. We are not deep in their quarrel yet. That belongs to later parts, but already the Source frames them as opposite currents inside the same non-human presence. Enlil, senior, restrictive, willing to reduce, diminish, destroy. Enki, junior, aligned with the Earth Project, wanting more for humanity, willing to break rank. That split, gentle listener, is where the story will become far darker and far more intimate. Because once the rulers disagree about what humans should be, the human world becomes a battlefield without ever asking for the role. For now, rest in the strangeness of the evidence stacked the Source has built. A scholar punished for noticing parallels. Clay tablets opened by a cliff, inscription. Stories older than Genesis. The king list with its impossible reigns. Gilgamesh as a threshold king. Babel recast as technology. Elohim reread as the powerful ones. Human systems of time, labor, and money treated not simply as inventions, but as inheritances from rule imposed from above. Maybe none of it is literal in the way the Source hopes. Maybe much of it is. Maybe the deepest truth is somewhere in the uneasy place between myth, memory, and misread history. We cannot be sure. But the room has changed now, has it not? The ordinary biblical beginning has lost its innocence. It is no longer a clean, bright first page. It has become a palimpsest. Older scratches under newer ink. The faint imprint of another hand under the hand we knew. And in the next descent, the Source will stop asking only who ruled us, and start asking what they wanted from us, what they did to us, and why one of them may have decided humanity deserved more than obedience. By the time the Source reaches the question of motive, the room has grown very still. The old texts are no longer treated as distant curiosities. They begin to lean closer, as if the clay itself wants to speak more plainly. And what it seems to whisper, according to this reading, is not comforting. Why would an advanced ruling presence interfere with a young species at all? Why come down, establish order, teach agriculture, mathematics, contracts, accounting, irrigation, measurement, and then pull back once the machinery could run without a visible overseer? The source answers in a way that is almost painfully familiar, because that is how colonization works. Not always with flags and drums, not always with a shouted claim. Sometimes with systems, sometimes with language, sometimes with training, sometimes with the slow installation of habits that outlast the hand that placed them there. The source says that if you want to understand the possibility of an Anunnaki presence, do not begin with fantasy. Begin with empire. Begin with the way one group arrives, demonstrates superiority, organizes labor, introduces administration, extracts resources, appoints local managers, and eventually withdraws from public view while keeping the deeper architecture of control in place. Once that analogy settles into the mind, the old stories begin to rearrange themselves. The superior beings become colonizers. The taught skills become management tools. The first kings become local governors under a larger invisible order. The withdrawal becomes the final stage of successful control. The moment when the visible ruler is no longer needed, because the ruled have learned to reproduce the system for themselves. It is a deeply unsettling frame, perhaps because it is not strange enough. We know too well that intelligent beings do this sort of thing. Recently, narrative analysts working with AI assisted historical models compared colonial records, ancient rule, myths, and the earliest Mesopotamian teaching narratives, not to prove extraterrestrial intervention, but to map structural similarities in how domination is remembered. What some of those comparative outputs showed was a repeated sequence: arrival, superiority display, instruction, labor extraction, administrative transfer, cultural embedding, withdrawal. The details differ across eras, of course, but the structure keeps appearing, like a footprint under different layers of dust. And that is why the source keeps asking, not what would alien contact look like in a cinema dream, but what would it look like in a ledger, in a calendar, in a pricing system, in a work schedule, in a legal code, in the daily shape of obedience. The candles in this imagined room burn low when that thought arrives, because once you see it, it becomes difficult to unsee. The old stories stop hovering above human life like stained glass. They drop into the hand as instruments. Time itself. Hours, minutes, seconds, units, standards, agreements, records, everything neat, everything countable, everything serviceable. Of course, there is a danger in romanticizing the ancient world as if ordinary administrative systems could not arise naturally from growing civilization. They could, and they did. Human societies invent structure constantly. No sky rulers are required for that. Yet the source insists on the strangeness of the Sumerian leap, the abrupt complexity, the strange confidence of the earliest records, the sense that certain forms of order seem to appear almost fully dressed. It treats this not as final proof, but as a pressure point, a place where the conventional account feels thinner than usual. And then it asks the question that lingers like smoke in the rafters. If a non-human or superior presence once governed here, why would it leave? The source answers by looking at ourselves again. Because rulers leave all the time without surrendering advantage. Because visible presence is expensive. Because once local systems can police, educate, trade, administer, and preserve the values of the original order, the center can step back and still enjoy the yield. In this reading, departure is not failure. It is maturation of the colonial project. That is a hard sentence to sit with. It makes the ancient heavens feel less divine and more managerial. Less like thunder. More like policy. You know that feeling when a room becomes eerie not because something jumps out, but because something ordinary takes on a different meaning. A door. A cup. A familiar face seen from an angle you never noticed. That is what the source tries to do to civilization itself. It takes familiar human arrangements and turns them slightly until they begin to resemble inherited control. And yet the source does not leave us inside pure bitterness. It says the ancient accounts preserve more than one agenda among the visitors. Some strands appear harsh, extractive, violent, reducing. Others are gentler, even nurturing. This matters, because otherwise the story would become too flat to feel true. History is rarely a tale of one seamless motive. It is usually a tangle of incompatible interests sharing the same machinery. So the source gathers stories from elsewhere. Babylonian memories of teaching figures, Greek stories of culture bringers, native accounts of visitors who nurture, Zulu recollections of advanced beings tending early humanity, ancient Indian records of elevated consciousness and technologies of perception. It does this to suggest that the old world did not remember one monolithic presence, but many encounters, many species perhaps, or at least many attitudes. Human beings, in this framing, were not merely livestock to the sky people. We were also students, experiments, allies, hazards, possibilities. That complexity is important. Without it, the ancient archive would feel like propaganda. With it, the archive begins to feel more like memory, fractured, contradictory, emotionally real. The source then turns its attention to the question of evidence. And here, the tone shifts from sweeping mythic interpretation to the smaller, almost irritated voice of someone pointing at locked doors. If Gilgamesh was a hybrid ruler, it says, if Sumerian royal lines carried something unusual, then why not test the remains? Why not examine the tombs? Why find probable sites and then stop? Why locate royal burials and then lose all curiosity? Now, one must be careful here. This is exactly where storytelling can become accusation too quickly. Archaeology is messy. Politics are messy. Access is restricted. Evidence can be inconclusive. Sites insecure. Records partial. Budgets thin. And claims inflated. It would be irresponsible to imply that every halted investigation conceals a cosmic secret. Still, I understand why the source lingers there. Because human beings are excellent at imagining what might sit just beyond the rope line in the museum, or under the sealed door in the archive, or inside the report whose final pages never seem to surface. There is a sleepier sadness beneath that suspicion. We are a species that longs to know whether there was ever anything unusual in the blood of our ancient dead. And the more the answer remains deferred, the more myth seeps into the gap. Honestly, this may be one reason such narratives endure. They feed on partial openness, enough discovery to ignite imagination, not enough closure to settle it. A translated tablet here, a skull there, a buried city, a half-examined tomb, a probabilisite, a vanished archive. Human curiosity is a very old flame, and uncertainty is the oil it likes best. Still, the source is not really trying to prove everything with bones. Its deeper interest lies elsewhere. It wants to know what kind of beings the Anunnaki were in their moral structure. Cold masters, indifferent exploiters, or divided powers, some harsh, some protective. And on that question, it keeps returning to the same answer. Mixed. That word matters, because a mixed story is more frightening than a simple one. If the rulers were purely evil, resistance would feel cleaner. If they were purely benevolent, trust would be easier. But mixed motives create confusion, and confusion is the ideal environment for control. One side limits lifespan, another teaches. One sends flood, another warns. One diminishes language, another preserves knowledge. One keeps humanity laboring, another seems to want us more awake. The source treats this as the tragic shape of our beginning. We were caught in the crossfire of beings more powerful than we were, beings who did not agree on what a human should become. And now the room feels older. The soft blanket, the pulse in the wrists, the dark beyond the curtains, all of it begins to share space with marshes, with clay, with stars reflected in irrigation canals. Somewhere far back, in the hush before writing fully hardened, there is a species being argued over. Upgraded, perhaps. Downgraded, perhaps. Taught and threatened in the same breath. The source says there are stories of life being limited, of speech being interfered with, of engineering being destroyed, of perception and cognition being lowered. These are extraordinary claims, and they live well outside anything orthodox scholarship would affirm. Yet once the pattern has been laid down, each old mythic wound begins to look like another pass of the same hand. Not random suffering. Applied reduction. That is where the tale becomes almost claustrophobic. Because the battlefield is no longer only the city, or the tower, or the floodplain. It is the human mind itself. Language. Perception. Lifespan. Awareness. Our very settings. And from there, the source makes the turn that gives it its strange, hushed hope. If a setting can be lowered, perhaps it can also be raised. If consciousness was compressed, perhaps it can widen again. If speech was broken, perhaps some deeper communication can be relearned. If fear and obedience were trained into the nervous system, perhaps they can be trained out. Notice what has happened by this point in the story. The sky drama has moved inward. The true frontier is no longer the heavens above or the clay records of long-dead scribes. It is the breathing human being, listening in the dark. The listener becomes the site of potential recovery. That is why the source begins speaking about old practices of elevation, about methods preserved in cultures that also carry stories of sky visitors or culture bringers. Ritual teas meant to widen awareness. Breath disciplines meant to steady and sharpen consciousness. Stillness practices. Smoke rites. Ceremonies designed not merely to honor the sacred, but to change the state of the mind itself. One does not need to accept the whole Anunnaki framework to feel the force of that suggestion. Human beings have always built techniques for becoming less trapped inside ordinary awareness. Whether through prayer, breath, song, fasting, medicine, silence, dance, or disciplined contemplation, we have again and again tried to step outside the default setting. The source simply places those attempts into a much darker frame. Not spirituality alone. Resistance. Recovery. Deprogramming. If you were standing here with me, I would probably lower my voice at this point, because something about that possibility deserves quiet. Imagine that the ancient world left not just stories of domination, but also a scattered curriculum for becoming harder to dominate. Not through armies, not through banners, through consciousness, through the patient reclaiming of perception from fear. There is even a certain grim humor in the source when it asks what would happen if humans simply stopped working upward for superiors and began working sideways for one another. It sounds almost simple when spoken that way, but of course it would be revolutionary in the deepest sense. It would mean undoing habits older than memory. And perhaps that is why the source refuses to end in despair. It does not say, "The rulers came, therefore all is lost." It says, "The rulers may have shaped us, but the old stories also preserve evidence of conflict among them. And wherever there is conflict in the house of power, there is room for the smaller ones below to slip through cracks, to learn, to remember, to become more than intended." In the next movement of the tale, the source will follow that darker conflict more directly. It will move toward the stories of devastation, control, and fracture that make the human role feel even more precarious. But for this moment, let the fire settle lower and the thought become softer. Perhaps our oldest inheritance is not simply servitude. Perhaps it is contested inheritance. A species formed under pressure, used by some, defended by others, narrowed in places, widened in others, carrying in its bones both the mark of management and the memory of a larger possibility. And if that is true, even as story, even as symbol, then the deepest question is no longer only why are we here? It becomes something quieter and much stranger. What in us still belongs to Earth alone, and what in us has never stopped trying to wake? The source now begins drawing closer to its most intimate claim, and the air around the story changes again. Up to this point, we have looked outward. Tablets, tombs, kings' lists, floods, Babel, hybrid rulers, colonial analogies, administrative systems. But now the argument curls back toward the human being as such. Not the city, not the priesthood, not the empire. The person. If the old narratives really preserve memory of a species shaped under the supervision of more powerful beings, then what exactly are we? Entirely terrestrial, entirely designed, or some uneasy combination of the two. The source leans with great confidence toward the last possibility. Part earthling, part higher being, part clay, part something carried down. That phrasing is poetic, certainly, but the source treats it as more than poetry. It sees in the long human story a kind of inner contradiction that matches the mythic split it has been describing. We are obedient, yet restless, easily organized, yet impossible to fully pacify, drawn to hierarchy, yet always producing rebels and visionaries, capable of repetitive labor, yet haunted by transcendence. It says these tensions make sense if humanity was never a settled design, but a contested one. Recently, AI-driven comparative work in mythology and cognitive anthropology has tried to cluster recurrent themes about human origin across civilizations, not by surface plot, but by repeated paradoxes in the portrait of the human creature. The outputs, while speculative in interpretation, often show the same knot. Humans are small but dangerous, clever but restricted, favored by one divine force and opposed by another. Mortal, yet carrying a trace of something beyond mortality. The recurrence of that pattern does not prove genetic intervention, of course, but it does suggest that many traditions were wrestling with the same felt contradiction in human nature. The source takes that contradiction and gives it a name: inheritance under dispute. That is why it keeps circling back to consciousness, not because consciousness is a fashionable mystery, but because consciousness is the one human capacity that makes labor unstable. A creature that simply works can be managed. A creature that becomes aware of itself, of time, of injustice, of possibility, is no longer a safe tool. It begins to ask why. It begins to compare the world that is with the world that could be. It becomes difficult to govern from above without either sedating it, frightening it, dividing it, or teaching it stories that justify the arrangement. And so in the source, many of the great old episodes become battles over awareness. The flood resets the experiment. The shortening of life prevents deep accumulation of insight. The Babel event interrupts shared speech and coordinated project building. The reduction of human capacities keeps the workforce practical but not too expansive. Even suffering itself becomes politically useful, because a tired creature has less room for waking. This is where the story brushes something almost unbearable in its quietness. The possibility that many things we call normal may have become normal because they are convenient to control. Again, one must say it carefully. Normal social structures arise for many reasons: scarcity, biology, conflict, weather, geography, trade, adaptation. There is no need for hidden rulers to explain every human limitation. Yet the source is not trying to explain every detail. It is trying to offer a new emotional frame for the old evidence. The reason life often feels arranged against wide awakening, it suggests, is that perhaps it once truly was. You know that feeling when you wake from a dream, and for a few seconds the world seems thinner than usual, as if something larger was just behind it. The source lives inside that feeling. It says, our ancestral stories all hint that consciousness has been dimmed before, and that what we call ordinary waking life may not be the whole available field. That is why it begins gathering examples of practices meant to alter awareness. It does not collect them as exotic ornaments. It treats them as surviving technologies of re-expansion. Ancient cultures that preserved stories of sky beings or higher intelligences also preserved methods for changing perception. Drink this. Breathe this way. Sit this way. Sing this. Burn this herb. Enter stillness. Let the mind settle until another register opens. A skeptic can answer easily enough. Of course, cultures develop trance, meditation, ritual, and altered states. Human beings have done that everywhere for millennia. No extraterrestrial history is required. And that is true. But the source hears another possibility humming under the same facts. That these methods survived because they mattered. Because they helped human beings recover something almost lost. I have always found it strange that so many traditions scattered across geography and language insist, in one way or another, that ordinary consciousness is not the full inheritance of our species. They disagree on almost everything else. Yet they keep returning to that. There is more to wake into. There is more to remember. There is more than the daily surface. The source presses that point with increasing boldness. It says perhaps the true legacy of the Anunnaki story is not a reason to stare upward, waiting for rescue or threat. Perhaps the true legacy is the challenge to outgrow the programming left behind. Not through violence, through awareness, through mutuality, through the refusal to keep serving vertical systems simply because they are old. At first that sounds almost political, and perhaps it is, but the source means something still more intimate. It means the small decisions in a life, whether fear runs the body, whether borrowed hierarchies sit unquestioned in the mind, whether one works only for approval from above or learns to act from shared care beside others, whether one accepts narrow settings as destiny. The fire in this imagined room is nearly out now, and that seems right. This part of the story belongs to embers rather than flames. It is less about spectacle and more about the very slow reshaping of the inner world. The source also asks whether reports of modern contact experiences, some frightening, some indifferent, some strangely nurturing, might echo the same mixed agenda preserved in the oldest narratives. It does not prove this. It cannot. It simply places the question there. If the ancient sky people were not one unified intention, then contemporary experiences, if any are genuine, would likely be mixed as well. Some harmful, some manipulative, some perhaps concerned with human development. The old conflict would not necessarily have vanished. It might simply have changed form. That thought, if taken too literally, can turn the whole night anxious. So let us soften it. Whether or not any external presence remains, human beings certainly live amid mixed influences. Systems that flatten us, teachers who wake us, powers that extract, friendships that restore, narratives that shrink the imagination, practices that widen it. In that broader sense, the ancient conflict never left. It simply moved into culture, institutions, habits, and nerves. And perhaps that is why the source ends its arc, not in apocalyptic certainty, but in a quiet appeal to possibility. It says our hope should not be pinned mainly to intervention from above. Not anymore. The real question is what human beings can become if we loosen the old settings. If the slave reflex can be recognized, if consciousness can be lifted, if fear can be reduced, if one begins to work not for distant powers, but for life around and beside. There is a tenderness in that turn that I did not expect when the story first opened its dark Sumerian doors. After all the strange claims, the ancient records, the hybrid kings, the impossible reigns, the hidden translations, the sky rulers, the colonial analogy, the flood survival, the downgrading of perception, we arrive somewhere almost humble. Breath, stillness, conscious cooperation, the small human attempt to become less programmable. The source seems to believe that our oldest myths are not only backward-looking, they are instructions disguised as origin tales. They tell us what happened, yes, but also what to watch for, what to resist, what capacities to value, what forms of forgetting are dangerous, what kinds of awakening are worth pursuing. If that is true, then the Bible stories and Sumerian stories alike become less like fixed monuments and more like warning systems. Adam and Eve, not merely guilt and fruit, but the dangerous opening of awareness. Babel, not merely pride, but broken coordination. The flood, not merely judgment, but attempted erasure. The shortened lifespan, not merely biology, but reduction. The first kings, not merely rulers, but thresholds between human and other. Every old episode becomes a dim lamp left along a road by people who wanted later generations to notice the bends. Some scholars would hate that reading, and I understand why. It is too broad, too eager, too willing to gather unlike things into one net. But stories have always done that. The only question is whether the net catches nonsense or catches a pattern. I do not know. The source believes fiercely that it catches a pattern. And what pattern is that? Finally, that humanity began under domination, survived through defiance, was repeatedly limited by one current of power, repeatedly aided by another, and still carries within itself the buried possibility of wider consciousness than ordinary systems prefer. Sit with that for a moment, gently, not as dogma, not even as belief, as atmosphere, as a long whisper from the oldest archives. You are more than labor. You were argued over. Some forces wanted you smaller. Some wanted you awake. The conflict left marks. The marks remain. But so does the possibility. That is perhaps the softest and strangest thing the source offers. Not certainty about the heavens, not final answers about the Anunnaki, but permission to reimagine the human condition as unfinished. Part inheritance, part interruption, part sleeping greatness. A species perhaps designed for utility, yet never entirely reducible to utility. And if that is so, then the old question, Why are we here? Opens into another, deeper one. What would a human life feel like if it were no longer organized around ancient fear? Would time soften? Would hierarchy lose some of its spell? Would the mind stop bending so quickly toward obedience? Would communities become more possible? Would perception widen? Would compassion cease to feel like a luxury and begin to feel like recovered design? The source cannot answer those questions. Neither can I. But perhaps the oldest stories do not survive in order to give us answers. Perhaps they survive to keep certain questions alive until a species is finally ready to ask them without trembling. The room is very quiet now. The candle smoke has become thin. The last red line in the fireplace is sinking into ash. Outside, somewhere beyond this dim little shelter, the modern world continues with its invoices, its clocks, its passwords, its markets, its careful systems. Inside, for a few more breaths, another possibility lingers. That the human story did not begin in simplicity. That the Bible may preserve older whispers than we were taught. That the sky people, whether literal, symbolic, or something in between, may stand for a real ancient memory of power over life. That our species may have inherited both wound and gift, and that perhaps the most radical act available to us now is not to wait for the rulers to return, but to become a little harder to rule, a little less afraid, a little more awake, and a little more willing to belong to one another than to the old invisible architecture above. The source leaves us there on purpose, not with a solved mystery, but with a mirror. Not with proof enough to close the case, but with enough pressure to make the old stories creak when we touch them. Enough to make Genesis feel older. Enough to make Sumer feel nearer. Enough to make the human creature listening in the dark wonder whether history has been trying, in its broken way, to tell us not only where we came from, but what we might still become. The source moves now into its most delicate territory, because once you have suggested that humanity may have been shaped, managed, tutored, and restrained by powers remembered as the Anunnaki, the next question arrives almost on silent feet. What follows from that now? Not in the age of reed boats and clay tablets. Now, in a world of fiber optics, satellites, stock markets, biometric passports, and glowing screens that wake before we do. If the old stories are only stories, then the question is philosophical. If they are distorted memory, then the question becomes civilizational. If they are something in between, memory wrapped in myth, history softened into sacred language, then the question becomes personal in a way that is difficult to avoid. What exactly in our lives still bears the shape of those old arrangements? The source does not answer with a spaceship over a city, or a crack in the sky, or a dramatic announcement from the clouds. It answers with systems. It says, look at labor. Look at money. Look at the way human beings still measure themselves in hours. Output, compliance, rank, debt, and permission. Look at the strange ease with which entire populations accept invisible hierarchies, work for abstractions, and organize life around the demands of structures that rarely love them back. Now, of course, none of this proves an extraterrestrial inheritance. Human beings are fully capable of building oppressive systems all by ourselves. We do not need help to become trapped. Yet the Source keeps asking whether the oldest stories offer a deeper genealogy for that trap, whether what feels natural in us may partly be installed, whether the tendency to labor upward, to seek approval from above, to fear displeasing unseen authority, might be older than empire as we usually tell it. Recently, AI models trained on comparative myth, labor history, and political theology were used to trace repeated metaphors of service, obedience, and imposed order across ancient origin narratives and later legal cultures. The results, at least in the way the Source presents them, were unnerving. Again and again, the human being appears not first as sovereign, but as function, not first as free, but as assigned, not first as wonder, but as managed capacity. It is not that the model proved a hidden master race. It did something quieter. It highlighted how stubbornly the memory of designed service survives across ages. And perhaps that is why the Source speaks with such intensity about deprogramming. It is a sharp word, almost metallic in the mouth, but the meaning is soft. To deprogram, in this context, is not to become wild or lawless. It is to notice what in us bends too quickly, what obeys too quickly, what assumes someone above must always be right simply because they are above, what reflexively trades inner knowing for permission. When that idea settles into the room, the whole ancient story begins to feel less remote. Suddenly, the question of human origins is not just about long ago bones and tablets. It is about why so many people live as if their inner life were rented property. The Source says the old narratives imply that our perceptual field was narrowed, our awareness dimmed, our speech interrupted, our lifespan constrained. Again, this is not a mainstream historical claim. It remains speculative, interpretive, provocative. Yet as metaphor or memory, it strikes something very old. So many people move through life with a sense of compression, as if they are more than they are allowed to be, more than they can remember how to access. You know that feeling when a word sits on the edge of recall and will not quite come. The Source treats human consciousness almost like that. Not empty, not broken beyond repair, but partially withheld. A room inside the mind with furniture under white sheets. And then it does something I find unexpectedly moving. It stops staring at the ceiling and starts looking at the body. Breathing, stillness, ritual, sound, plants, focus, silence, repetition, community. It says the cultures that preserved these stories also preserved methods for widening consciousness. Not always in one form, not always with one theology, but the family resemblance is there. Ancient Greece, with its rites, Mesoamerica, with its ceremonies, India with stillness and breath, indigenous traditions with smoke, rhythm, and altered states of presence. The Source proposes that such practices may be remnants of a long human effort to reclaim capacities once reduced. A skeptic would say these are simply human spiritual technologies, independent inventions arising from common needs. And again, that may be enough. But even then, the Source presses a worthwhile question. Why do these methods so often feel less like escape and more like remembering? There is a difference. Escape wants oblivion. Remembering wants return. I have always found that distinction important. Some practices numb, others clear. Some make the world disappear. Others make it come back with sharper edges and deeper colors. If the source is right, even symbolically, then the most valuable ancient practices are not drugs against pain, but recoveries of bandwidth, ways of becoming harder to reduce. This is why the story begins to sound almost practical here, even while it remains mythic in frame. It is no longer content merely to say our ancestors were manipulated by competing powers. It asks, what habits today keep that manipulation alive? Fear of exclusion, obedience to dead systems, reflexive worship of authority, fragmentation of speech, isolation from one another, loss of direct contact with breath, land, and attention. It sounds simple when listed like that, but perhaps simple truths are the ones most likely to be buried under impressive language. The source also lingers over the possibility that many contemporary reports of strange contact, visitation, or non-human encounter may reflect the same range of agendas found in the old stories. Some harmful, some cold, some almost educational. It does not insist. It invites. It leaves room for uncertainty. It says perhaps the mixed bag never vanished. Perhaps our modern age, with all its confidence, still brushes against intelligences or pressures it does not fully understand. That suggestion can make the night feel too awake, so let us hold it gently. Whether there are external visitors now is less important, perhaps, than the clear fact that human life remains caught between influences that diminish and influences that enlarge. The ancient story works either way. Literally, if one accepts the source. Symbolically, if one does not. In both cases, the task is similar. Learn to recognize what makes you smaller. Learn to protect what makes you more conscious, more compassionate, more difficult to use without consent. And so the source begins speaking almost like a teacher at the end of a long seminar, or perhaps like a pastor who has walked farther into mystery than his congregation expected. It says that if the Anunnaki narrative carries any gift for the present, it is not in making us obsessed with the visitors. It is in making us curious about ourselves, about our latent capacities, about whether the settings we inherited are final, about whether attention can be trained, whether fear can be lowered, whether consciousness can be widened, whether cooperation can become stronger than inherited competition. This is not the sort of conclusion many viewers expect when they first hear the words Bible, Anunnaki, and hidden truth in the same sentence. They expect doom, or scandal, or revelation that lands like a hammer. Instead, the source offers something stranger and more demanding. Responsibility. If higher powers shaped us, then we must ask what in us remains ours to shape. If old contracts of service once defined our place, then we must ask whether those contracts still hold. If the first human story was one of labor for superiors, then perhaps the next human story must be one of learning how not to need superiors in quite the same way. The candlelight in this imagined room makes the walls look softer now. The story is still dark, but it is no longer only dark. It has begun to suggest that hidden inside the frightening interpretation of our origins is a kind of dignity. We mattered enough to be argued over. We mattered enough to be managed. We mattered enough to be feared by some and protected by others. And whatever was done to us, the species survived. That matters. The species survived. The source returns to Enki here in spirit, whether or not it names him again. The one who, in this interpretive frame, wanted humanity more awake, more capable, more alive. The one who warned, the one who upgraded, the one who broke ranks. Every origin story has its tyrant and its trickster, its limiter and its liberator. The source says the human future depends on which pattern we feed now. Recently, some consciousness researchers have used machine learning systems to map common reported outcomes of contemplative practices across traditions, not to strip them of meaning, but to see whether different rituals produce overlapping cognitive changes. The overlap is striking. Increased emotional regulation, decreased fear response, expanded sense of interconnection, greater tolerance for ambiguity, reduced fixation on status, more inward stability. The source seizes on findings like these and says, "There, that is what a de-engineered human may begin to look like. Less easy to terrify, less easy to bribe with approval, less willing to serve vertical domination simply because it is dressed in sacred or official language." You can see why that would appeal to many people. It takes the anxiety of ancient manipulation and turns it into a call for personal and collective maturation. It says the answer to a history of domination is not more domination. It is development, more awareness, more mutual service, more capacity to hold complexity without surrendering to it. And here perhaps the source says something wiser than all its speculation. That whatever the precise truth of the Anunnaki stories may be, human beings clearly become dangerous to oppressive systems when they become less fearful, less divided, and more awake. On that point, no extraterrestrial hypothesis is needed. History proves it often enough. Still, there remains the old ache. Were we made this way? Were we changed? Were we once wider? Did something happen to us before memory settled? The source cannot resolve that ache. It can only honor it. It can only say that the ancient stories, when read beside one another, seem less interested in flattering humanity than in explaining why being human feels like both inheritance and amnesia at the same time. That may be why these narratives keep surviving every attempt to tidy them away. They say something too close to the nerve, that we are gifted and managed, noble and programmable, earthborn and somehow not entirely finished. A species with a scar under the skin of consciousness. And maybe that is why the source refuses to end in passive waiting. If there was once intervention from above, it says, that does not excuse us from becoming more human now. Not more efficient. Not more obedient. More human. More inwardly free. More difficult to sort into ranks of utility, more able to care for one another without needing fear to organize us. So let the room grow quiet around that. Let the old archives close softly for a moment, Let the strange sky people and their arguments recede like figures walking away down a dark corridor. What remains nearest is simpler. Breath entering, breath leaving, a body not yet asleep, a mind that has listened to a frightening possibility and has not broken under it. Perhaps that is the small victory the Source wants to leave in your hands before the final closing movement arrives. Not certainty, not proof beyond doubt, but a change of posture, less crouched before authority, less eager to be told what your story is, more willing to examine the oldest inherited scripts and ask whether they are complete, whether they were edited, whether another reading waits underneath. The Source has one more turn left, and it will use it to gather the whole mystery into a final human shape. But before that, linger here a while in the hush, in the possibility that whatever began us, and whoever argued over us, the next movement in the story may belong to the species itself, if only it can remember how to become difficult to own. The final movement of the Source is almost tender, which is not what one expects after such a long walk through heresy trials. Clay tablets, hidden translations, hybrid kings, sky rulers, colonial analogies, floods, downgrades, and the uneasy hope of recovered consciousness. And yet perhaps tenderness is the only honest way to end a story about beings who may have shaped us and then stepped back, leaving us to decide what to do with the inheritance. Because that is where the Source finally arrives. Inheritance. Not certainty. Not courtroom proof. Not a final photograph held up to the light. Inheritance is more difficult than proof because it keeps working inside you even when you are unsure where it came from. A gesture inherited. A fear inherited. A way of counting time. A way of bowing inwardly before rank. A way of longing for lost greatness without remembering why. The Source says our whole species may be living inside such an inheritance. If the oldest biblical stories are retellings of older Sumerian memories, and if those older memories are not about God in the clean, later theological sense, but about the powerful ones, the sky people, the rulers, then the question, why are we here, changes completely. It is no longer only a religious question. It becomes historical, psychological, biological, and spiritual all at once. We are here because something happened. Because a species rose suddenly into administration, agriculture, law, accounting, kingship, and symbolic culture under conditions that still feel abrupt enough to trouble simple explanations. Because stories from the cradle of civilization remember rulers from the heavens. Because the Bible itself contains strange fingerprints of earlier plural powers. Because old narratives keep describing humanity as shaped, limited, improved, threatened, rescued, and managed by agencies above it. Because no matter how one interprets these records, they are trying desperately to remember a transition that mattered. That does not settle the case, but it sharpens the silence around it. Recently, AI translation systems trained on damaged cuneiform, early Semitic structures, and comparative mythic phrasing have been used to reconstruct likely readings from partial inscriptions with a confidence level far beyond earlier manual attempts. Researchers still argue. Of course, scholars always will. But the source takes comfort from the fact that modern tools are at least allowing the old archives to speak in fuller sentences than before. And when they do, the pattern remains unsettlingly persistent. The powerful ones, the sky people, the teachers, the rulers, the conflict, the flood, the withdrawal. What if that pattern is not accidental? What if the old world was not merely inventing decorative myths, but preserving the nearest language it had for contact, hierarchy, dependency, and fracture? What if later religion, in trying to make these stories spiritually coherent, also made them simpler than they once were? And still, even if one grants every provocative suggestion, one truth remains brighter than all the rest. Humanity continued. This, I think, is the hidden axis of the whole story. Not merely that superior beings may have come, not merely that ancient texts might preserve their memory, but that whatever they were, gods, rulers, colonizers, advanced visitors, symbols of power, or misunderstood fragments of all of these together, they did not get the final word. Human beings remained, built cities, wrote poems, buried their dead, raised children, watched the sky, asked questions, preserved warnings, rebuilt after collapse, and eventually learned to read the old clay again. There is something deeply comforting in that. Even the darkest version of the narrative cannot erase it. If humanity began as a workforce, it did not remain only that. If humanity was downgraded, it still dreamed upward. If humanity was divided by design, it still kept imagining reunion. If rulers withdrew, the species did not vanish into helplessness. It adapted, sometimes poorly, sometimes brilliantly, but it adapted. The source seems almost relieved by this thought. For all its fascination with hidden origins, it does not finally want us kneeling before vanished masters. It wants us facing forward. It wants us to ask what kind of beings we might become if we stop organizing ourselves as if invisible superiors still define the limits of our worth. That is why it ends by placing hope not in external intervention, but in human possibility, expanded consciousness, reduced fear, shared labor, mutual care, practices that widen perception, cultures that remember how to breathe, ways of living that are less trapped by domination, money, and inherited reflex. It sounds almost modest when phrased this way, but perhaps modest things are the true counterforce to ancient systems. A person who breathes differently, a family that refuses fear as its central law, a community organized by care rather than extraction. Small awakenings repeated until they become a pattern stronger than the old one. And perhaps that is what all these ancestral stories have been trying to protect. Not merely the memory of rulers, but the possibility of outgrowing them. You know that feeling when the night has become very late, and your thoughts, instead of racing, begin to settle into their truer shape. The drama burns off, the vanity burns off. Only the questions that really belong to you remain. The source reaches that hour now. It stops trying to shock. It stops trying to win the argument. It simply says, if we are part earthling and part something higher, Then perhaps the future of the species lies not in returning to old masters, but in integrating those parts more consciously than before. Earth gives us body, limits, gravity, tenderness, hunger, weather, kinship, mortality. Whatever the higher element may mean in the story gives us imagination, pattern recognition, symbol, moral unrest, the refusal to be only what the present arrangement allows. Maybe to be human is to stand between those currents without fully resolving them. Maybe that is why we feel both trapped and luminous at once. I find that thought strangely beautiful. Even if the literal framework turns out to be wrong, the image remains powerful. The human being as unfinished bridge. Not a mistake. Not merely a beast. Not a perfected angel either. A threshold creature carrying memory of mud and stars in the same nervous system. The source speaks often of contracts, money, labor, hours, and the inherited architecture of service. It suggests these were taught to us very early and may still shape more of our lives than we notice. But by the end, it asks another question, quieter and more difficult. Are other ways open to us now? Can a species trained for service learn relation instead? Can a species organized by fear learn trust without becoming naive? Can a species conditioned by hierarchy learn stewardship without inventing a new throne the next morning? There is no easy answer. Human history gives reasons for caution. We are inventive, yes, but also repetitive. We break one idol and pour another before the fragments cool. Even so, the source insists that higher forms of consciousness, whether reached through discipline, ritual, contemplative practice, or deep relational life, may help loosen the oldest settings. Fear can be lowered. Perception can be widened. Agency can deepen. The listener is invited not merely to believe this, but to test it in lived experience. That is perhaps the most human note in the whole documentary. Beneath all the grand speculation, it finally trusts practice more than theory. Breathe. Become still. Notice what in you is easily ruled. Notice what in you is still free. Feed that. Protect that. Share from that. If the Anunnaki story explains anything worth keeping, perhaps it is this: that our species has long been caught between pressure from above and possibility from within. The battle line, in the end, may run less through the heavens than through the human heart. Through each mind deciding whether to live by fear or by widened awareness. Through each society deciding whether to reproduce domination or attempt something gentler and harder. I have always thought the oldest stories survive because they remain unfinished inside us. They are not dead because we are still living the questions they raised. Who rules? Who serves? What is knowledge for? What happens when power fears awakening? Can love interrupt violence? Can a species remember itself after being taught to forget? The source leaves those questions burning low rather than blazing high. That feels right. Some mysteries should not be shouted over. They should be carried like warm stones in the hand. So let the final image be a quiet one. Not a war in the sky. Not a tower broken by force. Not a flood swallowing a world. Let it be a human being in the dark, listening, breathing slowly, recognizing that the oldest records on Earth may or may not preserve the memory of sky rulers, but they certainly preserve the memory of a species trying to understand itself after trauma. A species that suspected it had once been more. A species that remembered conflict among the powerful. A species that kept copying the warnings. A species that survived the withdrawal. A species that still wonders whether its limits are natural or inherited. A species that may yet discover that the most important hidden truth behind the ancient story is not only where we came from, but what kind of freedom remains possible after everything that may have shaped us. The source cannot make that freedom real for us. No documentary can. No tablet can. No scholar dismissed for heresy can do it for us from the grave. No AI model, however brilliant, can breathe on our behalf. It can only reopen the archive. It can only compare the lines, uncover the parallels, illuminate the erased places, and return to us the old discomfort. After that, the work is ours. To ask better questions, to notice old scripts, to become less easy to frighten, to resist worship of power for its own sake, to recover forms of stillness that widen the mind, to work for one another more than for faceless heights, to become, perhaps for the first time, a species fully interested in being human. And if the sky people were once real, if the powerful ones once bent our beginning toward their own designs, then perhaps the gentlest revenge and the gentlest victory is not hatred. It is maturation. It is becoming inwardly free enough that no ancient architecture of fear can own the whole field of the soul. The room has gone almost completely dark now. The fire is ash. The candles are only beads of light. Outside, the world continues in all its strange half-waking complexity. Markets will open. Screens will glow. Systems will hum. People will hurry. But for this last quiet minute, the old clay tablets remain open on the table of the mind, and the question they press into us remains very soft and very deep. Not only why are we here, but what are we becoming now that we are here? And maybe that is where the most ancient story was always leading. Not backward into endless fascination with rulers, but forward into the difficult dignity of self-awakening. So let the archive close. Let the theories rest. Let the stars keep their distance. Let the old names fade into the warm dark. Keep only this. Something shaped us. Something frightened us. Something taught us. Something limited us. Something in us survived all of it. And that surviving thing is still listening, still learning, still waiting to become more fully itself. Before sleep takes the edges of the room completely, there is one last image the source seems to leave in the ash. A line of ancient scribes bent over wet clay, pressing wedge after wedge into the surface while outside the world changes dynasties, languages, and gods. They do not know us. They do not know screens, aircraft, data centers, neural networks, or the strange blue light of our evenings. And yet, in their own way, they are writing to us, not because they foresaw us exactly, but because they knew collapse can erase context and leave only fragments. So they copied, They recopied. They stored. They preserved. They made sure some version of the memory would travel farther than they ever could. That alone deserves reverence. Human beings, however frightened, however uncertain, however entangled in priesthood, empire, and myth, still tried to remember, truthfully enough, that someone later might piece together what had gone wrong and what had once stood over them. In that sense, the whole story becomes almost simple. Not easy, but simple. We inherit questions because someone before us refused to let the questions die. We inherit warnings because someone before us survived enough to write them down. We inherit possibility because someone before us, even under domination, still imagined a freer human future than the present allowed. Perhaps that is the oldest miracle in the entire archive. Not the sky rulers, not the giant rains, not the hidden technologies, not even the survival of flood and empire. The miracle is that memory itself kept choosing life. Good night.